Okay, welcome to Surf Environment, the third section of your lifeguard workbook. And we're discussing the unique environment that we as members operate in. If you're following along in your surf manual, it's pages 22 to 25. And if you are filling out your workbook or you want to check on any of your answers, that'll be in your workbook on pages 9 through to 11. Cool. Alright, so we start with what are waves and how are they formed? Okay, welcome to Surf Environment, the third section of your lifeguard workbook. And we're discussing the unique environment that we as members operate in. If you're following along in your surf manual, it's pages 22 to 25. And if you are filling out your workbook or you want to check on any of your answers, that'll be in your workbook on pages 9 through to 11. Cool. Alright, so we start with what are waves and how are they formed? A wave is a body of water moving along the surface of the ocean. Waves are formed by wind and storms at sea, so it affects pressure as well, obviously, with those two things. The factors that affect wave size or swell size, well, there's three golden rules for surf creation. Wave generation requires these three variables: wind velocity, wind duration, and wind fetch. So the harder the wind blows, the longer time it blows, and the greater distance it blows, the bigger the waves. Limiting any of these factors, any of these variables, will severely restrict the development of wave height and the transfer of energy into waves. So we'll find that we'll have weaker waves or we'll have stronger waves. So wind velocity, for example, if we have hurricane force winds, we've got really fast winds, we're going to have large waves. If we've got wind that blows for a long time, we're going to get bigger waves. If we've got wind that's come from a longer distance, it's going to bank up more water. And so that's going to make our waves bigger. Alright, wave types. So, the first thing I've got for you is actually a video of some members of public not realising what the waves are going to do, thinking that they're in a safe location and they're really not. We'll just skip through it to make it a bit fun. This is in Hawaii. And so they're calling their lifeguards to get help over there. She's not as injured as he is. And so the lifeguards arrive. And get them out. Wave types. This type here up in this corner, this is a spilling wave. And it's characterized by the top of the wave tumbling down the face of the wave. Its hazard level is low. So have a watch of this movie and you'll see it just crumbling, just spilling as he goes along it. Hard to get really smashed with a wave like that. This type, and you can see it's plunging. In New Zealand, we separate dumpers and shore breakers, but pretty much everywhere else in the world, anything that has this sweet tube, this beautiful barrel, they call it a plunging wave. So, a dumper, it's characterized by a steep incline of the sea floor, causing the wave to increase in height quickly and dump. It's a really high hazard level for swimmers and board riders, especially because our board riders are chasing these barrels. They want these sweet barrels. So this is a quick video of surfers in Taupo, or I think you say it Taupo, technically, in Tahiti. And you can get epic injuries from these: spinal and neck damage, concussion, broken and dislocated bones. At Bethel's we've had double broken femurs. I know Omaha has had full-on spinal as well, and that's just in the last 5 years. So have a watch of these surfers, these pro surfers, discussing what not to do with dumper waves.
What not to do with Chuck is, mate, just don't be in the lip.
What shouldn't you do? Well, you shouldn't go over the falls because that'll put you on the reef.
But don't you do it, Chubbs? Just like anywhere else, when the wave's here, don't be there, or you're gonna get drilled.
When the wave breaks here, don't be there.
Pretty amazing. So you can see why those sort of waves have got a really incredible ability to cause some mad injuries and some sweet damage. Alright, so the other one we separated into is a shore break. And so you've got these incredible pictures, but you can see that plunging wave is dropping you straight onto super shallow nothingness. So the characteristics of a shore break: a dumper that breaks on a steep beach face. And it's a high hazard for swimmers and board riders, but also for little kids on your sea, thinking, yeah, I'll just stay ankle deep. And so we see this sort of situation. And that's 100% why when you see a kid that's too far away from their parent, I'm thinking, I tell people to be within arm's reach of your child at all times. Otherwise, they're going to get collected by those waves. Something else that you'll see, we don't turn our back on the ocean. If we've done a tube rescue, you'll notice that you walk backwards. Your patient can walk forwards up the beach, but we're always watching the water, and this is why. But it's not all doom and gloom, remembering that our board riders are chasing beautiful barrels to catch. And so here are some kids just body surfing on some...
Let's go, your peace of mind now. Somewhere safe and quiet, tell your friends that we're alright now. It's that time now, let's go, your peace of mind now. Somewhere safe and quiet, tell your friends that we're alright now. It's that time now, let's go, your peace of mind now. Somewhere safe and quiet, tell your friends that we're alright.
Our shore breaker waves are beautiful and make for really interesting finishes and competitions as well. Makes it really hard to launch IRBs. If you have a beach that has a shore break, you need some really technically brilliant IRB drivers to be able to time it so that there's actually water for you to drive in, but you're not about to get drilled by a shore breaking wave. Alright, surging waves. Characterized by very deep water beneath the swell, and they come with pace. And they may never actually break as well. They're common around rock gullies and around rocks because you've got this deep channel here. All this water's funneling in, so they swell with a lot of pace here. They're really dangerous for our rock fishermen and our rocky foreshore users. So you might have kids looking in rock pools and stuff like that, or people choosing a fishing spot thinking, yeah, that'll get me right as far out as I can get, as close to this nice deep body of water where the fish are going to be. But not realizing that we should really stop and wait and watch the sea for a little bit before we choose our position. So, having a look at this picture, I want you to choose where you're going to fish, and we'll see if you're not covered by water by the end of this. Looking at the scale of this, look how little those trees are, and so this has got to be a good, I don't know, that's at least 10 metres there, so I'd understand if you chose to fish here, but unfortunately you're in some trouble. This is just sucking and pummeling you. Remembering that there's so much air in whitewater, there's so many bubbles that it's really hard to kick, which means you've been held down now for a really long time. You're still trying to come up. In that whitewater there's just nothing to kick against. And if you did choose to fish anywhere down below this line, now you're about to get sucked out and held under around this point too. If you were looking at rock pools over here, you've just been grated down this edge as well. So making sure that you step back and you actually choose your spot really, really wisely. Knowing what your tides are doing is going to be really handy for us as well. Alright, what are tides and what causes them? So, the alternate rise and fall of the surface of the sea is caused by the attraction of the moon and the sun. And because the earth is spinning, the moon is spinning around the earth and it's all spinning around the massive sun even though it's further away. All of the spinning pulls the sea. So, in New Zealand we have what are called semi-diurnal tides. So we have 2 high and 2 low tides each day. From high to high tide is approximately 12 hours and 25 minutes, which means if you guarded on Saturday and you're trying to work out what your tide will be on Sunday, high tide will be approximately 50 minutes later each day. In these sort of situations, we've also got a couple of different ways or amounts that it's going to pull the water. So you've got a spring tide. Now spring tide occurs every 14 days at the full, that's the full moon right there where we can see it super illuminated, and the new moon, or it's backlit by the sun, therefore you can't see it. They cause the biggest tides because the sun and the moon are pulling in the same direction. So you can see here, the sun pulls the water towards it, gravitational pull, but the moon, because it's heaps closer, this is obviously not accurate, is also pulling it. So that's going to be a really big tide. Because we've got this stretching effect, it's doing exactly the same thing. The sun's pulling the water out here and the moon's pulling the water out there. It's that twin bulge on either side. So that is our spring tide. Those are our spring tide situations. On a new moon and a full moon, we'll have the biggest tides. Now, twice a year, because the Earth wobbles on its axis, part of the Earth will be closer to the sun. Right, so imagine that it's wobbled, and now, twice a year, this part is just that little bit closer to the sun, and therefore closer to the moon as well. And so now we've got an even bigger spring tide. So that can happen on a new moon or a full moon as well. So that's a king tide. Twice a year the wobble of the earth makes the sun and the moon particularly close to the earth, creating an even bigger spring tide, known as a king tide. Neap tides. So they happen at the quarter moons. The sun and the moon are pulling at right angles. So you can see the sun here, the moon here. And so these tides, this water bulge here, nowhere near as big as when the sun and the moon are working together. And that's the same here. So you might see, from the sky we'd see a crescent moon at night, for example, or something along those lines. And that bulge is nowhere near as big as when they're working together.
Tides, the up and down movement of the oceans, are a result of three main forces: the influence of the moon, of the sun, and the rotation of the earth. The earth and the moon are mutually attracted by a gravitational pull. But inevitably the point on the earth furthest from the moon is less drawn than the point closest to it. Thus the gravitational force has an effect of stretching the earth, causing the sphere to deform and the waters of the oceans to produce twin tidal bulges or static tides. The effect of the sun is the same, but because of its considerably greater distance from the earth, the influence is only half as great as that of the moon. If the earth, moon and the sun are in alignment, the effects are multiplied, and it is then at the highest tides, the spring tides, occur. But if the earth, sun and the moon are at right angles, their effects counter each other and produce the lower neap tides. All this is, however, influenced by the rotation of the earth, whose main effect is on the time and place the tides occur.
What is the difference between a rip tide and a rip current? The terminology is different around the world, but for us, a rip tide occurs as water rushes through estuary and inlet entrances during tidal change. So a great example of that is here at Omaha Beach. And this is the Whangatiao Harbour and T Point. A lot of fishermen will launch from this point as well and head out here for great fishing grounds over these ways. Unfortunately, however, this whole area here fills up at a high tide, but all of that water as the tide changes has to come through this tiny point, which means we have a rip tide situation. We've got a hell of a lot of water pulling out, and they've had some tough situations with boats capsizing and whatnot in this area. This is the Waimakariri River Bar, and so you can see again there's going to be a mass amount of water coming out of here through tidal change times, and you get a lot of surfers in this area as well. Your beach is going to change a lot, and I just really like this time lapse for just a little bit of an understanding of how different your beach can be at low tide due to when compared with high tides. You've got these massive poles on this boat here, and so when we fast forward it, you really do get to see that every inch of that is necessary. And imagine that greater tidal difference on one of our beaches that has waves as well. I mean, we're kind of asking for trouble there. A rip current in comparison to a rip tide. A rip current is the mass movement of water getting back out to sea. And so we can see here, there's a really nice rip pointed out. And what's happening is the waves come into shore, but to get back out to sea, they end up slipping down into this deep gully, and that's a rip. That's a rip current. And they use that deep channel to get back out to sea, kind of like an escalator. Why are tides important to understand? Tidal effects can be hazardous because they can change the wave conditions. They can expose sandbars, increase the effects of rip currents, affect fishermen and beach users crossing tidal estuary mouths, decrease or increase access to the rocky foreshore. And on our beach specifically, we have that situation where we've got people trying to get across to O'Neill's, and they have to cross that little stream, which at a low tide is no issue. But at a high tide, if you time that wrong, you're going to get sucked out into the associated rip that pulls straight out from that river mouth. You're also going to get cut up on those rocks if you try and cross, or just slammed against the cliff edge. So that's a really big hazard for our beach. That's one of the big things that changes with tide. Another thing that changes with the tide for us is which rip is actually going to be stronger. So we have a hole and rip situation straight out the front of our tower that's been there for a good 15 years, and but the rip situation that used to be beside, or that is beside Ihumwana, the island just to the north of the tower, that one used to be a hell of a lot more dominant. What we find as the tide changes, our swimmers no longer get pulled towards the island into that rip, but our swimmers get pulled south into the hole and rip situation in front of the tower. And they end up feeding into each other anyway. Those two rip situations join. But so that's one of the effects of the tide. It changes which rip is going to be stronger for us. It also changes spilling waves into dumpers as sandbars are exposed. So it pulls water into the hole in front of the tower at Bethells and exposes a sandbar there right. If we're not quick enough to move our flags, you'll find that your swimmers will start getting dumped, or at least your backline of swimmers will start getting dumped straight onto that sandbar. That's when we start doing in-water flags as well, because you find if people end up stepping off the back of the sandbar, we've got some issues. This isn't Bethells Beach, but it is a beautiful picture of associated sandbars with a rip situation. So this video here is a tide-dominated beach type, and so a tide dominated beach type, it's the tide is the dominant factor for deciding what type of substrate we'll have, what type of sand is created, what species can exist here as well, whether it's fish or plants. For us at Bethells, our biggest environmental factor is our waves and how powerful they are. We have dissipative waves, very strong, very powerful waves, and so they're our biggest factor. So our beach, and pretty much the whole west coast really, is wave dominated. So wave dominated, tide modified, tide dominated. Those are the main ones that we think about when we're characterizing beach types. Rip characteristics. Alright, so we used to get to put amazing dyes in the water to show public an understanding of how rips work, but then they realised that it's actually not that good for the ocean, so we don't do it anymore. The characteristics of a rip, we might see a calm patch with adjacent breaking waves. So this is nice and calm, but we've got waves coming in over here. Rippled crisscross water or waves, so the waves can't come in straight because they're already being pulled out. A foam water trail, so we might actually see the opposite, where you've got a beautiful clean wave and a gap and another beautiful clean wave, but this whole area where the rip is might be foamy. We can have discoloured water, not so much because they put dye in it, but because if the water's pulling out, then it's going to be pulling out all the dirt and the sand and detritus and sticks and seaweed and all sorts of stuff as well. So you might find that's telling you where your water's moving. We might have adjacent sandbars like we saw in that last picture. Because that channel's been dug out, the sand deposits have happened either side of it. Alright, this is a picture of Karekare, and it's a really beautiful example of what we call a permanent rip. A permanent rip is stationary all year round due to very little change in the conditions over time. So this headland here is not going anywhere. They often occur where there's a barrier to water movement along the beach, so the water can't get out past this, so it sucks along this edge and digs out this beautiful channel along this, and so you can see where it's wrapping around. and that'll pull people back out to sea. We see this at Karekare, but we also see it beside Lion Rock. At Bethells, we see it beside Ihumoana, either side of our island, and also the south end of Muriwai next to the rocks as well. So you've got, again, that hard barrier, and the water just digs out the sand beside it, creating that beautiful channel. That's a permanent rip. This is a picture from on top of Lion Rock of North Piha, and can you spot the rip? If you said right through here, awesome, good work. So you can see it curves out, so they're not directly straight out to sea. A fixed rip is accompanied by a hole or gully on the ocean floor with sand as its primary base. Once established, it may last for hours or months and is dependent on the movement of sand. So a storm could move the sand around and shift this entire rip, or could split it up into a whole bunch of rips along here. You can see that it's associated with this gully, this hole here, but this pretty much describes most of our rips, right? Associated with a hole or a gully, because it's dug out that channel to be able to get back out to sea. Examples of this: the hole or rip situation directly in front of the Bethells Tower is another example of this. Or this is just to the right, like I said before, of Lion Rock, United North Piha, in the summer of 2015. Now the situation has since changed. Our rip at Bethells, the rip and hole straight out the side, straight in front of the tower, has been there for like 15 years, as far back as I can remember anyway. But we used to be a lot more worried about the rip beside Ihumoana. Travelling rips. Travelling rips move along the beach and can cause havoc with swimmers, forcing us to slide our flags. They're pushed by certain directional conditions of the waves and wind. So if we've got a really strong crosswind, you might find that we're getting a rip moving sideways along your beach, as in sliding sideways, not moving parallel. And you see this along some of your longer beaches. Muriwai, United North Piha, yes, Kareaotahi as well, where there's that massive distance for that wind to bank up as well, and it just slides your rip as it digs out a trough and slides it sideways. Flash rips, we see this one at Piha most definitely. Temporary rips generated by increased volumes of water brought onto the shore. These rips occur unexpectedly without warning and subside rapidly. More so with the Piha situation, the sea floor is so changeable, and what you end up seeing is that because of those large volumes of water, it messes with the sea floor rapidly, creates a rip, but then covers it up again, creates a little gully channel, and then covers it up again and creates one somewhere else. So at Piha you might find that you get a rip that develops inside your flags, you move your flags, and then half an hour later that rip has gone and you can move your flags back. So you have to be really on your toes if you're guarding at Piha as well. Why are rips handy? Well, they're quick ways to get out the back of the waves to perform a rescue. What if a rip starts to affect our flagged area? Well, it's really important to note that our flagged area is going to change over the day. So our most important thing is that we, one, notify the public and then move the flags. We want to have the best position. So the conditions change with the tide and the weather, so don't be afraid to move the flags to a better spot if one opens up, rather than keeping it in a current spot and letting our flags get unsafe. We just need to inform the public in a friendly way that it's for their safety. It's handy to let them know why. So statements like, hey, now that the tide has turned, the southern rip is getting a lot stronger, so we're just moving the flags north to a bit of a safer spot. We might be able to hop the flags, as we call them. So if you imagine that the F of flash rip here was the southern flag and the northern flag is the semicolon, If I was to move the flags a half hop north, the southern flag would come to halfway, and this northern flag would move that same distance north. A full hop, I could technically leave this flag right here, and I could move this flag, that full width of the flags, north. So that, I hope that explains hops for you in terms of moving your flags. The other thing that you might find is that we actually pull everyone out of the water and take the flags to a completely different area rather than sliding it through a dangerous zone. So that's another option. Don't be afraid to pull people out and suss a different spot and replace your flags in a safer spot. It's for their safety, and they might not be super stoked about it at the time as a member of public just wanting to have a swim, but they'd be less stoked if they end up getting dragged into a boat because they end up drowning. This is some video footage of some rips as well. You see that water movement? Wave trying to form, but it's not really making any progress. See how that foam's moving over this way? So this little feeder is feeding out. I mean, in New Zealand terminology we might call it a travelling rip, but really that's a feeder current feeding into another rip that probably runs out here. There. Swimmers don't often realise that they're in them, so even if you're on flags and someone walks past you, letting them know, hey, just make sure you keep checking behind you to check that you're still inside the flags. And there's a good example of that foam trail, eh? So he's right in that rip. And as he bounces, as you do when you swim, he hasn't even realised that he's getting pulled further and further out. And a lot of people also will just be chasing. They're just looking for that breaking wave to play in. It's a nice calm area. Oh, but I want to dive under a wave, and that wave hasn't come to me. So they keep just hopping out and hopping and hopping until they get to the point where they can't actually touch the ground. And that's when they start fighting it too. So, parts of a rip. You can see here in this picture, and then a two-dimensional, stereotypical view of it. Here's our sand, and here's our sea. So we've got currents coming in and feeding out. There are your feeder currents through the neck and then to the head of the rip. Stereotypically, anyway. Feeding water in here, so the waves come down and they get fed sideways. At this point here, you might find that we're seeing some waves coming in on diagonals as well, as they start getting pulled out while they're still breaking over these sides. And they get fed into the neck of the rip, fast moving, and then into the head where we see all sorts of water moving, swirling and as it dissipates. So what do we do if caught in a rip? Well, that's going to differ depending on who we're talking to as well. So for us as lifeguards, you might find that we go into the rip. Maybe we're just checking to see how strong this rip is, or maybe we are trying to figure out where to put our flags and we end up getting pulled into this rip. If I was a strong swimmer, maybe I'm able to swim diagonally out of the rip back to shore. But again, if we don't get this placement right, we're going to be battling those feeder currents as we come back in. So it's not really the best move. It's going to waste a lot of energy. A better idea would be for us to let it take us out and then swim 30 to 40 meters parallel to the shore and catch a wave back in. So that's one option that we could offer to offer for telling public as well. What we really want public to do though is we want them to stay calm. At first we want them to try and stand up. Maybe it's not that deep yet and they can stand their ground until help gets to you, or until enough of a wave can move you in slightly and then in a bit more and then in a bit more, and then we can get out, or maybe we can move sideways a little bit and find ourselves out of that deep hole. If that person can't stand up, we want them to stay calm, put their hand up and float on their back until help comes. It will be tiring keeping your hand up, so definitely put your hand up and then give it a rest, and then put your hand up and then give it a rest. Maintaining floating is the most important thing. It's really important to remember that rips only travel out to the back of the last breaking wave, because the water then disperses. It's too deep for the seafloor to action on it, and that water will move in different directions. So you don't have to worry about ending up in the middle of nowhere. We just float on our back. It'll take us just out past the furthest breaking wave, and we just float on our back and sit pretty until a lifeguard gets to us. So if you are doing a lifeguard exam, I expect all three of these to be mentioned, or a refresher or something like that, and all three of these are handy to let people know depending on how they characterize themselves. Again, I'd use weak swimmer. This one just seems like an unnecessary waste of energy. Holes. Okay, so a hole is an isolated, deep body of water, a trough that runs parallel to the shore. They're dangerous because swimmers and little kids can find themselves in deep water very quickly, and this is what we found before. We're just packing up, our flags are down, and we're going around doing preventative actions of people on the beach, and you find people, they see the tower at Bethel's and they think, what a great spot to swim, straight in front of the tower, but they don't understand that that tower is fixed to the ground, but the sand actually moves, and so they end up walking straight into a hole. So it gets deep very quickly. They're completely unaware of the conditions. They see a nice flat area and they think, oh, what a great place to swim. So that gets quite scary quite fast, and that's why we're always telling people, don't swim if lifeguards aren't on patrol. That's an easy enough rule to follow, I think. How are they formed? Rip currents dig these holes out as they pull water back out to sea, which is why rip currents are often associated with them. And you can see one here. Beautiful foamy water, nothing. It's too deep for those waves to form. So we'd expect to be knee-thigh height about here, and then it's going to drop off, and you see that colour change in the water as well. Really, how do we know if a hole is located there? Well, I'm not gonna rely on the fact that there's no waves here. I'm not going to rely on the fact that I know that it's discoloured. If I want to know that there's a hole located there, I'm going to go in the water and I'm going to check myself. And that's also how we spot the best place to put the flags as well. Yes, I'll get a high vantage point and I'll have a look for all of those telltale signs. I'll have a look for where my holes are located, for where my rips are located, all of those sort of things. But I'm also going to put myself or a lifeguard in the water to check on it. It might mean that maybe we already knew we're not going to put our flagged area here, but maybe because of how strong those currents are, we need to put our flagged area even further away from this hole than we were planning on doing, because of how strong the current is pulling into this hole and then feeding out into a rip. It's really important to go in the water and check where your holes are, for a couple of reasons. So you know when public are going to get into trouble, and also to avoid this sort of situation. Looks like it's getting deep. really what happened was he just swam across a hole. Ugh. Not the best look. Maybe duck dives would have been a better idea first. Sweet, and that's all of the surf environment. Definitely check out your manual for more details on things, and remember that the terminology does differ slightly from other places in the world, but this is what's required for your New Zealand Surf Lifeguard Award. Cheers!